Thank you for joining us for another episode of Hijrah Talk. I'm your host, Timothy Caldis. Joining us today is Franz Prutsch, who is a regional thematic specialist in border management. He has previous experience in East Africa, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate having you here.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Welcome to the program.
Thanks.
So, generally when we discuss border issues and border controls, we're hearing a lot of emphasis on increasing restrictions and on making sure that there's more restrictions in terms of the number of migrant laborers entering countries. Are there examples of the opposite happening where we're seeing a softening of those restrictions and encouragement of more free movement?
Okay, more or less border management is seen as a management tool for managing migration, but also to provide security. So the main emphasis on border management is often the security aspect, and especially nowadays where you have movement of terrorist fighters or irregular migrants in general. This is a very sensitive issue for many governments. But there are also good examples where the facilitation of movement of persons, goods, services, and also capital has shown very good results, actually. And if I can refer to the European Union as an example of these liberties, what brought on one hand also a period of peace, but also of prosperity, economic prosperity. And I think this is something what everybody's looking for worldwide. I mean, people want to have a better living. They want to have certain standards of how they can live, how they can move around, and how they can also grow their family and prosper. I think this is something what the freedom of movement is a core element of it. Because to be confined to one country, and especially nowadays where families are spread over the entire world, that relatives are living in different countries, there's also a need to keep the contact with them, to move somewhere where you have better job opportunities, and maybe also to bring a benefit back to your home country because you invest back home or you are bringing back experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Are we seeing examples outside of Europe of this? Have there been other efforts at free movement protocols elsewhere?
Exactly, especially the African continent has a few similar unions which have been already established. If you just think about the Eastern African Community, EAC, then also ECOWAS, what is in West Africa, and also in the South. I mean, the main reason is, of course, economic prosperity, to promote business, to boost economic opportunities, but there's also a link that even people have to move, because if businesses and economies are thriving, there is also a need to have labor. And labor is something what some countries have more than others, and other countries have more capital than labor. So there is a need to combine it and also to make it possible that the needs of businesses but also of people are met.
Yeah, so it seems like when you develop better free movement protocols or stronger free movement protocols, you have to also think about governmental integration as well to facilitate these things. And you were describing the situation with ECOWAS, but also to what extent has that been seen in the EU, and how have they benefited from greater integration to manage free movement in their own experience?
If we just talk about the European Union, you have to see that it started with a core group of countries, and then there were several expansions.
Yes.
So, and every enlargement was a challenge at some point, not only for those who joined the European Union, but also those who were already in the European Union. Economies and businesses has to adjust themselves, because you need to be competitive as well. And that's quite a challenge for some countries, especially for newcomers who have before had a protected economy, where you can just raise the taxes or customs duties in order to protect your own products. But this is not possible afterwards. So this needs to be kept in mind as well. And as I said, I mean, European Union, it is a success story. I mean, even if today some countries are discussing, does it make sense that we stay within the European Union? I mean, I just have to point at Brexit. All this discussion is somehow also touching upon migration, but not really from the security aspect. It's more from an economic aspect, where countries just say, okay, we lose a little bit our competitive advantage because others are catching up.
That makes a lot of sense. I think touching on what you were talking about concerns about specifically the free movement, we've seen in other situations an emphasis in agreements focusing more on just the free movement of capital without the free movement of labor, different free trade agreements,
exactly.
And even some of the negotiations happening in the EU right now with the UK. What are the costs and consequences of only having free movement of capital and restricting the movement of labor?
The problem with just to concentrate on one or two free movements, because they are easy for you to accept, is that the free movement of capital is more benefiting already the richer one, the more developed one, because capital is available. But there are also countries who have, or where you can say their capital is the laborer, is the workforce, what they can offer. So they don't have the capital to invest somewhere, but they have the labor force who could work and send back remittances and boost once again the economy at home. So there's a kind of, if you just focus on capital, it benefits only those who are already well off, but leaves apart those who are trying to catch up. Without the free movement of labor, I think it's just, you're looking just for half of the benefit. And it's not like that you're increasing the capacities in the entire economic area what you have working with or where you're focusing on. It's kind of, you leave somebody behind, and that's not really what works, because then you have one wins, the other one loses.
Yeah. Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, he was speaking about this issue, and he said that if you only have the free movement of capital without that free movement of labor, you have this problem where the workers are put in a very precarious position vis-a-vis capital. That's something that we're seeing with the European Union, with that integration and the ability of workers to move, that they're kind of raising the standards throughout the Union. Was that something that we're seeing in terms of the less well-off countries after they've joined? Do we see that kind of raising of wages in those countries?
I just want to refer back to the European Union, and especially one country, what is Poland, which is a big country and a big economy within the European Union, where laborers moved to UK and other countries in order to get higher wages. And of course, they left a gap back home, because the economy in Poland was also thriving. And then this opened the job market for neighboring countries. So the need for labor in a country like Poland was filled by neighboring countries' workforce. And this is something what goes beyond the European Union, and it creates a market of consumers. Because if you have a job, you can buy products, you can ask for services, you can get whatever you need and what you were looking for by having a job. And this is something what really creates a huge benefit and contributes to economic growth as well. And if you just think about even beyond the European Union, I think if you look at the African continent, all these economic agreements what had first mainly a factor of facilitating and the movement of goods, and also to reduce customs duties, moved further to allow also the movement of persons, because when economies grow, you need labor as well.
So there's a cascading impact when these agreements are in effect, and both the wealthier countries benefit from filling their labor gaps, while the countries of origin are actually bringing in new workers and having new economic opportunities domestically, is what you're saying. Is there any sort of idea or like some research from economists thinking about what kind of impact would come if we were to extrapolate and expand this into a more global context for free movement of people? What kind of possible impact might that have on the global economy and economic growth?
I mean, there are a lot of estimations out there, and of course it's very difficult to put a figure on it, because there are so many aspects where free movements are contributing. One is in those countries who are already developed, so It's economic growth, and maybe businesses grow bigger and they have more revenues, and they can have more shareholder values to be distributed. But there's also the remittances part, but sometimes is also forgotten and not calculated in this equation. That investments back home are sometimes more effective even because you start from a lower level. You have a strong impact in your country of origin with the remittances what you send back, because you have more opportunities. It has more effect in the local economy. Mm-hmm. So therefore there are estimations which go very high to up to 100% or whatever. But definitely that free movements, protocols, and the freedom of movement is something what is changing a lot of economies, but also how a government is interacting with neighboring countries.
Thank you. So we're seeing this compounding effect of where there's benefits not only in the host countries of filling their labor gaps, but also in countries of origin where new economic opportunities are created and migration from other countries coming in to replace laborers that depart, expand opportunities for those people as well. And so there's a kind of compounding effect. At the same time, some of the estimates that I've heard, as you were mentioning, are quite substantial. As much as 100% of global GDP could be unlocked with free movement of people on a global scale, and something that could even dwarf removing what remains in terms of restrictions on free movement of capital. So these are a lot of positive elements. I was wondering, is there anything of concern beyond the securities prism, such as I've heard some things about the potentially negative impact, although slight, on wages for low-skilled workers in the host countries, the ones who are already there, that could come with an influx of migrant labor. Have you seen anything like that? Or what have been the experiences of the countries that already have these free movement protocols in place?
Of course, there's also a challenge in just to ensure that a minimum wage is paid and there is no black market for laborer. Because everywhere where you have a benefit, there's also the dark side, where some are trying to benefit from facilitation or liberalization of rules. And of course, I mean, there was, even in the European Union, there was a trend that labor migrants were forced to work for a lower wage than officially was the limit as a minimum wage. But also how you can run around those restrictions and creating one-man businesses. That if somebody is a laborer, he's also his own boss, and he has created his own company, so he was free from those restrictions of a minimum wage. So there is always a kind of that governments need to be aware that where there's a benefit, there's also a trend to misuse and to avoid these procedures and these restrictions and those controls by different measures.
And do you think that the reaction that we're seeing in Europe is proportional to the challenge, or is there perhaps an overreaction? I mean, from what I understand, the spike in irregular migration that we saw in 2015 has subsided, and we're more or less back to pre-2015 figures. Does it seem like the wave of restrictions and concern that came as a result of that has kind of carried long beyond the extent of the challenge?
As I said, once again, it's a political discussion, and especially populist parties are using this kind of terminology and even misused the proper terminology, because they are naming everybody how they prefer to, and also to put more fear to their voters in order to get more votes at the ballot. But this has changed a little bit. There was a huge trend just because of this high number, relatively high number of arrival in Italy, and also in the Balkans when they moved on. But there was also made the mistake that even those countries were not able to check identities or even to manage these flows. They were overwhelmed, they were not prepared. So even if you think about high developed countries like in the European Union, some countries, they were not able to check these flows in a proper way, just according to minimum standards. So actually, the fear of people who are residing in the European Union, they say, we don't know who came because we didn't care about checking the identity, so we don't know who we took in and if somebody is really in need of protection. I think this is a mistake what needs to be taken into account.
So there needs to be better infrastructure in place.
And also preparedness. I mean, there's nothing where you can say, okay, there's only one border, you only have the border checks. You have also to think about for a situation where border management is overwhelmed by the influx, by the movement of people who had genuine humanitarian needs. But it's just like not everybody qualifies for asylum at the end of the day.
Assuming that the proper border management techniques can be put in place and the capacity to deal with fluctuations in the number of people coming in are developed, what are the steps that could be taken to perhaps look at unlocking the potential, though, of encouraging more movement or moving us back to a place where we saw free movement as an ideal to work towards? Are there ways to encourage that? Are there ways to address the fears in the discourse that you see as perhaps missing from the current debate? What are your thoughts on that?
In many countries, in those countries who are receiving migrants, I think the perception of migration is something like, okay, somebody wants to come and wants to stay. But that's not how migrants today are thinking about their movement. Now it's either a circular migration movement, that they say, okay, I go somewhere in order to get a good job and earn enough money in order to establish a business at home, or I have a better life at home, once again with my family. But there's also secondary movements that one comes to a country, what is the first destination country, and then they move on because they see other opportunities in different countries. So there is not kind of one-off that somebody wants to move and also stay there forever. Migration is today has many aspects, and what I always want to say is also that, I mean, there are sending countries what are kind of seen as source countries for migration, but also those developed ones who are receiving are also sending migrants somewhere, labor migrants. They just call them expats and not labor migrants.
Absolutely.
And I mean, that's just exactly. I mean, I'm a good example for that as well.
Right.
And therefore, I mean, there needs to be a very neutral discussion about migration in general. Migration has a benefit, but there is also, as I said before, an area where misuse and even crime can prosper.
Sure.
And that needs to be tackled.
I think it's also just important to remind people that while we think about free movement, we think about general labor migration as a south to north phenomenon,
yeah, exactly.
as we've seen elsewhere. I mean, for example, the examples that you provided, such as ECOWAS in West Africa or the arrangement in East Africa, and as well we see a lot of labor migration in Southeast Asia. There's plenty of migration that's happening south to south to take advantage of labor opportunities and economic opportunities as well. And that's a part of this discussion and a part of unlocking the potential for everybody for the benefits that can come with more free movement and more protocols in place to facilitate legal, documented processes that are safe for the workers and also protect the interests of the countries involved. I want to thank you very much for this conversation. It was really helpful. And hopefully we'll have you back in this near future.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Take care.
It was a pleasure.